La transition écologique, le redémarrage de l'Europe. D'autres sont des menaces, comme le terrorisme. Je me battrai de toutes mes forces contre la division qui nous mine et nous abat. C'est ainsi que nous pourrons rendre au peuple français, à chacune et chacun d'entre vous, dans sa vie professionnelle, personnelle et familiale, les chances que la France lui doit. Aimons la France. À compter de ce soir, et pour les 5 années qui viennent, je vais avec humilité, avec dévouement, avec détermination, la servir en votre nom. Vive la République.
Well, coming after Nicolas Sarkozy's controversially bling mandate and François Hollande's self-declared normal tenure, Emmanuel Macron has described his presidential style as Jovian, this in reference to the Greek god Jupiter.
Emmanuel Macron is just arriving now. That is the scene. The victorious president-elect.
Emmanuel Macron, the charismatic 39-year-old former banker.
He will become the country's youngest leader after Napoleon and the first elected president outside France's 2 main political parties.
France's youngest president ever, here dubbed Le Kid.
Centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron has won the French presidential election, easily beating far-right candidate Marine Le Pen.
C'est un omniprésident. Voilà, vous permettrez ce néologisme, c'est-à-dire.
He's an omnipresent president. He wants to be in charge of everything all the time, but that's very dangerous.
Former investment banker and former cabinet minister who has never run for public office before has been elected the next president of France. He does not come from either of the main traditional political parties.
Now, Macron got a lot of slack when he used that word Jovian. What does he mean by it?
Emmanuel Macron is a young president.
He's the youngest French president ever to be elected.
En France, c'est-à-dire président de la République. Et après 2 quinquennats.
His predecessors Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande somewhat mishandled the presidential office. Emmanuel Macron believes that power should be vertical. He is, therefore, a Jovian president. France perhaps needed this monarchical image to be at peace with itself.
And he was an unknown quantity when he took power. Has the exercise, the reality of power, had an impact on that Jovian, above-the-fray image?
For Macron, being a Jovian president is a way to establish his authority. He establishes his authority, and at the same time he wants to bring people together. And to do so, he needs to have this above-the-fray image. This is what enabled him to launch his own political movement, even before the election.
Emmanuel Macron has also been very active internationally. He's taken a keen interest in crises such as Lebanon, Syria and Jerusalem. Keeping up with Emmanuel Macron isn't easy. The energetic young president has thrown himself into a frenzy of activity at home and abroad since being elected in May.
And there were unflattering media reports about his wife, Macron's former high school teacher, 24 years his senior.
Everybody understands that he's hugely intelligent. He's always been the smartest guy in the class. He's a very, very tough negotiator, very stubborn. He's a lot tougher than you think.
The handshakes, the hugs, the back slaps, the bromance.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'll get that little piece of dandruff for that little piece. We have to make him perfect. He is perfect.
The French gave their support loudly and clearly for Macron and for a united Europe.
In terms of Europe's defense and autonomy, we now have a foundation for that, which has emerged over the past few months. In June last, we have laid the foundation of this Europe of defense with a permanent, structured cooperation between our countries, allowing us to take increased commitments to move ahead together and better coordinate and even have a European fund for defense. What Europe is lacking today, what this Europe of defense is lacking today, is a common strategic culture. Our inability to work together in a convincing manner challenges our credibility as Europeans. We do not have the same parliamentarian, historical, political cultures. We do not have the same mentalities, and certainly we're not going to change that overnight. But I suggest that we should start creating this shared culture by putting together a European intervention culture. And in order to do that, we need profound change. At the beginning of the next decade, as a result, Europe will have to have a common intervention force, a common budget, and a common doctrine to act.
It is my privilege here today to take the floor before you. I know to whom I owe that privilege. I owe that privilege to all of those who, just over 70 years ago, rose up against the barbaric regime that had seized my country, France. I owe it to those nations that heard our cry of resistance. I also owe that privilege to those who, once the war had ended, dared to take the path of reconciliation and to build a new international order. Multilateralism, the multilateral approach, is facing a challenge in meeting the challenges of nuclear proliferation. Pyongyang has crossed a major threshold in military escalation. Allow us to acknowledge the stakes. Our responsibility, together with all of our partners, including China and Russia, is through resolve to bring North Korea to the negotiation table for a political settlement to this conflict. France rejects escalation and will not close any door to dialogue, provided that the conditions are brought together for a dialogue in favor of peace.
What an extraordinary day. Thousands of reporters from all around the world here just south of the demilitarized zone to witness this historic and emotional summit. Just weeks ago, this whole region seemed under the looming threat of war. But these two men, the leaders of the two Koreas, in striking symbolism and long talks, are trying to bring, in Kim Jong-un's words, a new era of peace.
The two men, so different, seem to enjoy it all, chatting among the trees on a picnic bench alone for almost 45 minutes. The two leaders promising to sign a peace treaty this year, formally ending the Korean War and pledging the denuclearization of the peninsula. Arms raised in triumph, and then an awkward embrace. Afterwards, Kim Jong-un stepping out onto the world stage as a statesman for the first time, saying, "We are one nation and cannot be separated. We are one blood." With that promise of peace, North Korea also agreeing to diplomatic talks with the U.S. It will be the first time any sitting U.S. president will meet with a North Korean leader.
Things have changed very radically from a few months ago. You know, the name calling and a lot of other things. They're treating us with great respect.
It's an astonishing turn of events.
And it is the same objective that I would like to speak in favor of the nuclear agreement with Iran. We put together a solid, robust and verifiable agreement with Iran that will ensure that Iran does not obtain nuclear weapons. Renouncing it would be a grave error. It would be irresponsible for us to fail to uphold that agreement, because this is a good agreement, an agreement that's essential to peace, at a time when a downward spiral cannot be discounted. Thanks to dialogue, we have managed to resolve the Iranian situation. Dialogue, multilateralism is the only way forward, and that applies to North Korea too.
Because this was not a U.S. treaty, this international agreement. It was international. You have Russia, China, France, Germany, the UK, EU, and the U.S. signing on, along with Iran. Netanyahu wants the U.S. to pull out of the 2015 deal, which froze Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Last week, the leaders of France and Germany lobbied President Trump to stick with it rather than tear up the deal as promised on the campaign trail.
And Israel is pushing him harder to scrap the agreement. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went on primetime TV in Israel to say that, quote, Iran lied about wanting to build nuclear weapons.
But it does contradict Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif's claim on Face the Nation that Iran's past nuclear program had been for peaceful purposes.
Iran was never racing towards a bomb, and it will not be racing towards a bomb.
Well, Marzia, what you see behind me is one of the largest military parades staged by the Iranian army south of Tehran in a place called the Mausoleum, in front of the mausoleum of the late founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. So the Iranian army today in Tehran and across the country, in major cities across the country, are staging large-scale military parade as a show of might and preparedness of the Iranian army. So,
a show of military might. The Iranian army staged countrywide parades on Wednesday to mark the National Army Day.
Overnight missile strike targeted government military bases in northern Syria. The group said that Israel likely carried out the assault that killed 26 pro-government fighters, including many Iranians. Social media video showed the purported attack, which hit an arms depot near Hama. Iranian fighters are said to be stationed there, but the Iranian government denied they were hit.
The attack on the Syrian army's 47th Brigade was so powerful that it registered a 2.6 earthquake.
Today, a top Iranian official has just promised a swift and decisive response to Israel's recent activities in Syria. Earlier this week, missiles struck a Syrian base where potentially dozens of Iranian nationals are believed to have been killed. Israel has remained mum on any involvement, and Syrian state media initially blamed the United States, but top U.S. officials say Israel led the operation. But for Israel to be 100% sure that Iran doesn't develop the bomb, is there any other path besides war? I mean,
look, if there is an alternative, neither Netanyahu nor Trump have put it on the table so far. Because again, we have even the former head of the Mossad backing the claim of the IAEA, who says there is no credible evidence at this time at all that Iran continued to develop a bomb after 2009. Now, it may have held on to this archive, which originally it developed in 2003, which yes, potentially means that Iran did obscure the true intent and the extent of its progress, but without a plan B in place, the world is obviously very anxious to see what's going to happen if and when Trump decides to topple this deal.
I cannot say whether my successor in the far future, in 70 years' time, will have the privilege of speaking before you. Will multilateralism survive this time of doubt and change? In truth, we ought to recall the state of our world 70 years ago, a world that was broken by war, that was stunned by genocide, and we ought to try to regain the optimism that we held up in the face of so many reasons to doubt back then. We must regain faith in what brings us together. We must find trust again and confidence in these founding values of the United Nations, universal values that protect all individuals across the planet and guarantee their dignity. But the challenge that we face as a generation is to regain our values, to recognize that there is nothing more effective than multilateralism in our current world, because all our challenges are multilateral. War, terrorism, climate change, the digital economy, etc. We can only address those challenges through multilateralism. Not through the law of the fittest, the survival of the fittest, because our vision of the world, if we are to achieve our vision of the world, it's only through multilateralism that we will do that, because our vision is universal, not regional.
And I think that it would be much better that we come together and prevent the divergences increasing.
A new global and shared framework. And this framework should be based on cooperation and multilateralism, and absolutely not on a sort of new hegemony or fascination on new powers. It would be a huge mistake. Which means we have now a tremendous responsibility. Because this new framework, this new compact is the unique way to protect our interest on the long run, our common good, and our people. The answer is partly here, in this room. And in a certain way, our new frontier is not a geographical or a technological one, but it's much more our commitment. We are our own frontier, in our own conscience. If we commit ourselves to make our current globalization more fair, sustainable, in favor of middle classes, if we commit ourselves to enable our youth, if we commit ourselves to take into consideration long-term and complexity of our decisions and not just short-term returns, so we can converge and build a new globalization, understandable and good for our people. So this synthesis, which is the core of our globalization and our multilateral approach, was made in Europe. And if we want to avoid this fragmentation of Europe, we need, of the world, sorry, we need a stronger Europe. It's absolutely key. And my view is that we have to redesign a 10-year strategy because that's not an overnight strategy. A 10-year strategy to make Europe an actual economic, social, green, scientific, and political power. I delivered a very long speech in September last year, and we worked very hard, but I do hope with my friends here present in this room, we will work together to have, at the end of this year, this common strategy for 10 years in order to provide visibility to our people and to the rest of the world about the fact that Europe is able to be this new power and basically to deal with some of those.
Rather, we should think of ways to build a stronger Europe in the world as it is, and as a result create the 6 keys of sovereignty and freedom. And in face of all of these challenges, we need to do a number of concrete things. The first key, the foundation of any political system is safety. In Europe, we're seeing a dual trend. A progressive disengagement and inevitable disengagement of the U.S., and, on the other hand, a sustainable terrorist phenomenon whose mission is to fracture our free societies. In these areas, at long last, Europe has realized how frail it is and how important it is to act together, to fight against terrorism, to fight terrorist propaganda on the internet. A few of the EU's countries have started doing that together. We need to reinforce our common safety and create a space for common defense and safety. In terms of Europe's defense and autonomy, we now have a foundation for that, which has emerged over the past few months. In June last, we have laid the foundation of this Europe of defense with a permanent, structured cooperation.
But in the 20th century, there were other candidates who rode. Adolf Hitler seemed to be, in many people's mind, the perfect candidate, and he seemed to fit perfectly until, of course, he was defeated and died. And then people began to look at the rise of the European Union, and they say, well, initially there were 10 nations in the European Union, so maybe the European Union is it because there are 10 kings, 10 nations, but today there are 27, and now it's a little bit harder, and they seem to be having their own heart disease, so they're not quite the force or the power that many of us anticipated they might be. Others have even suggested that this is Islam. Now, that's a harder comparison to make. But that final, ultimate, world-crushing Antichrist, whom Paul referred to as the lawless one and Revelation calls the beast, is still yet to rise on the world scene, at least in a recognizable way. It's funny because when John Kennedy was assassinated and took a wound to his head, there were many people who said, well, John Kennedy probably is the Antichrist because he's a Roman Catholic and he got shot to the head. Only problem is he was dead then and he's still dead now. And then Henry Kissinger became a great candidate for a season for reasons I won't know. Some even picked Ronald Reagan, but that was just the Democratic Party. There's been a lot of people who have tried to figure out who exactly is going to be the beast. And I'm not sure that that's even a knowable possibility for you and I at this point, but it is knowable in terms of what is the organ or the vehicle from which he arises, and that becomes, in my mind, even more important. And the question is, what kind of form will this take? Because, again, think about how Daniel described this last world empire. That first of all, he said it would be global in its authority. He was given authority over every tribe, every people, every language, every nation. It's a universal authority, a global authority. Let me tell you the one thing I know for sure. In John 4:3, he says to us, the spirit of the Antichrist is even now in the world. The spirit that empowers him isn't waiting for him to rise. It's already at work in our world right now. But all they did was manifest that same spirit of Antichrist, because this has been the long agenda, as we talked 2 weeks ago. So I come to the very last thing, since I'm just barely over time here, and which is, considering this series is a real victory. What about those 10 horns, those 10 heads, those 10 crowns? Well, I don't have a lot of time to develop this, but let me tell you what my thought is. And again, I could be completely wrong.
Je me battrai de toutes mes forces contre la division qui nous